Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, the final installment of our Group of Five previews to get all of you guys and girls ready for the upcoming college football season that inches closer by the day, by the hour, by the minute. I am your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by the man that's done all the heavy lifting to get us to this point with a conference that I know both of us are excited to break down in the Sun Belt. You, of course, can follow Brad Powers on Twitter at BradPower7. Brad, I mean, you've been living and breathing with all of these teams since their bowl games were over. Group of Five, as exciting as the Power Five. I know our listeners are clamoring for more Brad Powers any way they can get it.
I don't know if that's the case. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of the listeners are ready for Payne to jump on board and start talking Power 5 next week. But I think we're going out on a positive note here because we've been talking a lot about how these conferences are watered down. The average team power rating is going down over the course of the last 7-8 years in a lot of these Group of Five conferences. That is not the case with the Sun Belt today. Yeah,
we've been able to bookend it for those folks that haven't tuned in and they may be finding Bet the Board for the first time. Encourage you guys to go back and listen to all the Group of Five previews. We started with the American Athletic, spent our quality time in Conference USA, the Mountain West, the MAC, and of course now diving deep into the Sun Belt. And as we've done, Brad, to kind of set the table for all of these conferences as we look at them, it's trying to place in a historical context in terms of what we see in the league this year compared to what it's been in the past. And you've done an outstanding job of obviously contextualizing all that, going deep into the annals with your power numbers over the last 10 to 15 years. How does the Sun Belt stack up in 2023 compared to what we've seen 3, 5, 10, maybe even longer than that, given the fact that the programs in this league continue to turn over seemingly on an annual basis?
So, wow, yeah, I could really go back to when the Sun Belt, when North Texas was winning like 4 or 5 conference titles in a row there, and they did a few times, made bowl games and made waves with a losing record. I mean, but at that point, it was pretty bad. In fact, I would think at that point, the Missouri Valley Conference, the SoCon Conference at that stage in the FCS might even been a better conference. But flash forward to 2022, and if you're just looking at average team power rating, I thought last year was the best year ever. And I'm not here saying this is a hot take, trying to grab a headline. I mean, it was. I mean, look no further than, let's not talk power rating. Let's just look how they performed in big games. Marshall over Notre Dame, an upset. App State over Texas A&M. Georgia Southern over Nebraska. Old Dominion over Virginia Tech. South Alabama could have beaten UCLA. So, I mean, we're just not talking 1 or 2 teams in the conference. We're talking as a whole. A lot of these teams were able to pull shockers. And I'm here to tell you, I rewatched a bunch of those games, Todd, and there wasn't nothing fluky with the Marshall Notre Dame game or the App State Texas A&M game or Georgia Southern's upset. I mean, they were pretty legitimate. Where the Sun Belt team was the better team that day. It wasn't that they were +6 in turnovers or whatnot. So this is a conference that the future last year was very good and the future looks bright. And with my average power rating heading into this year, I don't see much of a. I mean, maybe not as good as last year, but, I mean, we're talking maybe a point down from what they were a year ago. And that's saying something because this conference just, 5-6 years ago only had 10 teams. Now they have 14 teams. You're thinking, they're watered down. That's not the case. They're not watered down. It seems like they're only getting stronger.
The only fan base, Brad, that may take umbrage with what you just said would be those folks down in New Orleans who watch their beloved Green Wave go down to Southern Miss and turn the ball over and create short fields about 37 times. In that contest, but you're exactly right. I mean, when you
notice, I didn't mention.
I saw you conveniently left that out, but I'll take a jab for the loyal Tulane fans that are out there listening to this podcast, knowing that Tulane will have their hands full with yet another Sun Belt member, and we'll get to that, in a few moments. But you're exactly right. I mean, for anybody that tuned into Sun Belt football, oftentimes you watch a Power 5 program and then you flip on a Group of 5 team and you see the difference in speed, you see the difference in physicality. And while I'm not putting South Alabama on the same level as the Alabama Crimson Tide, these are teams that were athletic. They had playmakers out in space. They were able to make difference, and you see a lot of those transfers that have allowed this league to try and get to a spot that it hasn't been in the past. And to your point, a lot of reason for optimism coming into this season for what some of these teams can do. And if they're going to catch the attention of the national media market and college football fans alike, I mean, do you see games in the non-conference portion of the schedule that are going to have you intrigued, not just as a bettor, obviously, but also as a college football fan?
Well, certainly. I mean, I think week 1, there's a really intriguing game at the Group of 5 level. It's South Alabama against Tulane. Now, I think I bet, full disclosure, I bet Tulane in the game. But, I mean, just to show the respect that South Alabama's getting, I mean, they're on the road to Tulane, a Tulane team that, just coming off the Cotton Bowl, returns their quarterback and whatnot. And South Alabama's a touchdown underdog. That's not too shabby, saying, how good this conference can be when you start off with something like that. Is there as many opportunities, at least on paper, as I see now? I mean, I'd like to be able to predict, the 3 touchdown upset, outright upset wins like Marshall, App State, and Georgia Southern. But as of right now, I'm not seeing it because, I mean, when I'm looking at my projections, what I am seeing are 6, 7 teams that are going to be hovering around that 7, 8 win range. I'm sure there'll be 1 or 2 that break through and flirt with double-digit wins. But at least on paper for right now, I don't see as many outright upsets as what they had a year ago. Not saying that, it won't happen, but when you look at some of the experience levels of some of the teams at the top, I question if they're going to be as good as what they were a year ago.
And to your point, Brad, obviously, just going through some of the non-conference games, there don't appear to even be that level of opportunities unless you are going to forecast a 3-touchdown underdog winning outright, which if any of us could do with alarming regularity, despite your college football acumen, you wouldn't be willing to bless us with your time to record these podcasts. You'd be sitting somewhere on a beach in Turks and Caicos, sipping a Mai Tai, a pina colada, or a beverage of your choice. I mean, you mentioned the South Alabama-Tulane game. A couple other unique contests, week 1 and week 2 to keep their eye on. Look, this matchup, in my opinion, would have been a heck of a lot better if Jamie Chadwell was still the head coach for Coastal Carolina. They'll travel out to Westwood to take on UCLA, and we know that they'll get the Bruins' full attention because of what you mentioned last year. South Alabama almost going into the Rose Bowl and winning outright as right around a 2-touchdown underdog. Week 2, Troy goes on the road to the Little Apple to take on Kansas State. A lot expected of what Chris Kleiman and company are trying to accomplish there in Manhattan. So we'll see if Troy is able to push them physically. And then South Alabama, as if it's not difficult enough going to Tulane and Ullman Stadium week 1, they'll follow it up week 2, headed to Stillwater to take on an Oklahoma State team that's rebuilding. So as you try and identify some of those opportunities, and the Sun Belt wants to get their kudos, those may be games that are worth watching for the casual observer. One last thing before we get into the individual teams themselves, Brad. I mean, is there anything specific that you'd attribute the rise of the Sun Belt to? I mean, I know we talked about population shifts with the MAC and some other things, but do you feel that the current level of coaches in this conference is contributing to why this league is distancing itself or at least asserting some level of dominance amongst its Group of 5 compatriots?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly have done a good job hiring. I mean, look no further than what Troy and South Alabama have done in very short order with new head coaches. And I don't think it was of the fluke variety. I think it was legitimate hires. The question is, whenever you see a guy win as much as what Troy and South Alabama did a year ago, how long can you hold on to a young coach like that? Because they're going to be hot commodities in the market. Not only that, but obviously, and I know it sounds boring, but it is population shift, and population shifts leading to obviously more blue chip recruits in southern states. And if you don't believe me, I looked up some of the data. Obviously, throughout our lifetimes, Florida, Texas, California have been pretty much staples as far as the 3 main states that produce not only have big populations, but also produce the highest quality in college football players and the most number of college football players from the high school level. But I think in the last 20 years, what's changed is, when I was growing up, Ohio and Pennsylvania were arguably top
Yep.
5. I mean, you had obviously Florida, Texas, and California, but if I had to stack rank them, 4 and 5 would be Ohio and Pennsylvania. They even played like a big all-star. I remember the Ohio-Pennsylvania high school all-star game used to be huge that they used to play. What's happened is they don't play that game anymore, and for good reason. There's just the number of prospects coming out of those two states is not what it used to be. The number of prospects coming out of Chicago, not what it used to be. So where are these prospects coming out of that we didn't see before? I would argue Georgia, maybe within 5 years, believe it or not, could pass California as the third state as far as producing blue chip recruits and whatnot. The other states in the South, Louisiana, in my opinion, has passed Ohio and Pennsylvania and lapped them in some regard. Alabama, even with their low population, is producing great high school players. I mean, I don't know if it's a Nick Saban effect. Everyone's flocking to that state or whatnot, but Alabama's up there. The Carolinas are big, and the DMV area, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, producing a ton of high school talent. So all in southern states there, and who benefits from this? Obviously the SEC schools do, but you're starting to see these Sun Belt schools. And I'll say this. I mean, I know this is in the weeds, but with more reliance on the transfer portal from the big schools, I think these Sun Belt schools can take advantage of high school recruiting. And I'm not saying that they're going to get 4 or 5 stars, but they can. I think what we'll see is the App States, the James Madisons, the Georgia Southerns of the world and whatnot. I think we'll start to see some of these schools get more high-end 3-stars. And there's a big difference between a high-end 3-star that's top 600-700 nationally than a guy who just gets 3-star labeled because he signed with the team. So I think we're going to see some of these Sun Belt schools, because less reliance at the top on high school recruiting, they're going to get more talent from the high school ranks. So, again, I don't see it slowing down anytime soon.
It's always wild when you look at some of the shift, and obviously we've seen it over the years in college football, transfer portal being part of it. You mentioned high school recruiting and, of course, population shifts as you try and identify these leagues before they get there. And to your point about these programs, it's all about retaining their head coaches and making sure that they don't end up leaving some of these schools high and dry. But you have that level of continuity, and we'll see if it can pay dividends in the Sun Belt. When we look at continuity, we may as well kick things off, and we'll go kind of east-west and bounce around a little bit. As always, all of these breakdowns are time-stamped. If you don't have a chance to listen to the podcast in its entirety, you can break it down by team. You have a boatload of time before the season starts to make sure that you cover all of these teams in great detail. And we talked a little bit about teams making the jump, Brad, from FCS to FBS in Jacksonville State, Sam Houston State, and we broke down Conference USA. And kind of a team that established a gold standard for that last year was the James Madison Dukes, led by Curt Cignetti, who will enter his 5th season at the helm there in Harrisonburg, Virginia. When you look at JMU, their win total set at 8.5, but they have some unique dynamics in play for their season. And before we get into some of the X's and O's and how we go about forecasting JMU, you mentioned the odds for the ability to win the conference and to bet into those markets. The reason a lot of those aren't posted for the Sun Belt is because of JMU's status, but they were declined their waiver, at least as of now, unless something drastically changes, aren't going to have an opportunity to win the conference, much like they didn't last year, or to compete in a bowl game. How does that impact the way you look at the full body of work, or how does it adjust your handicapping for JMU deeper into the season, knowing that they may not have that carrot at the end of the stick?
It's a really good question. I think last year it wasn't that big of a factor because I think there was so much excitement coming into the FBS that, the fact that they couldn't go to a bowl game, couldn't win the league, I didn't think was that big of a negative. With this year, with the uncertainty, hey, can we win the league this year? Because they're legitimate. They're certainly, I would argue from a power ratings aspect, they might have been, when healthy, they might have been the best team in the Sun Belt a year ago. Now that's been denied, I wonder if they lose a couple of games, is the motivation there? Yeah. I'm not sure. It's something that there's certainly some reasonable doubt there. So, but I'll say this. I still think there's excitement there from what they did a year ago. And even if they can't win the championship or go to a bowl game, Cignetti's won, almost immediately here at the FCS level. And then last year that, maybe some other programs I'd be more concerned about it. It's not factoring into my handicap too much because we talk about mispricing. Obviously, the market mispriced them, including me, mispriced them big time last year. I thought they mispriced them yet again this year because DraftKings opened up their win total at 7. And it was one of the biggest positions I took was over 7.
I was going to say, I mean, that was 7, no longer available for those folks who are just tuning in. 8.5, kind of the prevailing price tag out there. You mentioned that level of excitement, and the program actually just broke a record for priority season ticket holders this year. So that speaks volumes about what they're trying to build there and that level of tradition, knowing that they were an FCS juggernaut in the past. I mean, you look at how they started last year, 5-0 start, included a massive comeback win at Appalachian State, got them ranked for the first time barely a month into the FBS membership. When you look at the roster construction, Todd Centau came in last year, stabilized that quarterback position. As far as this offense coming into the 2023 season, better, worse, or on the same level of where they finished last year?
I'm going to go worse. We'll start at quarterback. I think they'll be okay at quarterback. I mean, I didn't expect the kid last year to have a 25-5 ratio because, I mean, he was kind of meandering when he was at Colorado State. But they bring in a kid with experience in Jordan McLeod. He's been at Arizona. He's been at South Florida. He's got 23 combined career starts for him. Was hurt last year. Maybe he would have been, a kid that we know a little bit more about if he didn't, hurt his ankle a year ago. So I think they'll be okay there. Where I do worry is top rusher gone, 4 of their top receivers gone. And look, they're bringing in a bunch of skill position talent, a lot of experience from the FCS level. I always wonder when you're jumping up, how does that, they hit a home run last year jumping up, but constantly when you got the upgrade in opposition, I'm eager to see how those FCS transfers, whether or not they work out. But it'll be a decent offense, just probably not as explosive as a year ago.
You mentioned the quarterback play last year. I guess we should realize that anyone that leaves Fort Collins under Steve Adazio's leadership on the offensive side was immediately going to experience an upgrade purely by default when they could enter the 21st century instead of playing football like it was the 1890s there. Defensively for JMU, much expected of a couple of headliners on that side of the ball. It appears on paper that there is a good amount of experience returning, but I know when you dig into the transfer portal, you look at some of the difference makers there. Are you as optimistic as a lot of the quotes coming out of Harrisonburg are for this season?
Yeah, one thing I will say, I failed to mention the offense. What helps is all 5 starters back on the offensive line. Something that always gets overlooked and was overlooked by me, talking about the offense. So that should help that young skill position talent when you got all 5 guys back there. Defense, I'm a little bit more optimistic just because they got 8 starters coming back, and that includes a big transfer loss that they had post-spring. Ukwu on the defense ended up going to Ole Miss, a guy that was probably their best pass rusher, 7.5 sacks a year ago. But pretty much other than that, everyone else is back. Keep in mind, heading into last year, they lost a couple of key transfers on defense. It was one of the reasons why I was a little down on them. So I think they're in better overall shape, even from a depth aspect. Keep in mind, they started off hot last year, had a midseason slump. They're a little bit banged up. We're not at 85 scholarships a year ago. We'll be at 85 scholarships this year. So I think the defense will be one unit that, obviously we're productive a year ago, but I look for them to be still, maybe one of, if not the best defense when you look at some of the losses that maybe a Troy had. This might be the best defense in the Sun Belt this year.
Non-conference game to watch right out of the gates. Week 2, they'll go on the road and play Big Brother, so to speak, in Charlottesville against Virginia. I know that's a game that I'm sure JMU fans and players have had circled on their calendar going into the season, so I'm very curious to see how they perform on the road against an ACC foe, and knowing that they didn't quite hold their own last year when they ran on the road to Papa John's and took on Louisville. We head down the road to Conway, South Carolina, and it's the Coastal Carolina Chanticleers. Going to be led by Tim Beck in his first season. We talked about Jamie Chadwell moving on to Lynchburg, Virginia to take over at Liberty. You look at Coastal's win total, 7.5. You have to lay a price if you want to go over that total. Only fitting that a spring game in Conway ends up getting washed out on the Smurf turf. But Brad, when we look at Tim Beck coming in, the former offensive coordinator at NC State, the biggest coup for this program wasn't necessarily landing Tim Beck, and I'll get your thoughts on his hire in a second, but it was re-recruiting Mr. Sunbelt himself and the face of Coastal Carolina football, Grayson McCall, to return for yet another campaign.
Surprising, because, once he entered the portal, you thought, Grayson McCall would be a kid that probably end up in maybe an SEC school. How could you not love the production that he's had over the last 3 years? This is not a misspeak. 78 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. 78-8. touchdown interception ratio, it doesn't get much better than that, not only last 3 years, but even historically in college football. And obviously, when healthy, he's also a mobile quarterback. So, I mean, when you talk about recruiting, I mean, I would argue, for at least for a Sun Belt team, that's a 5-star caliber recruit. I mean, your best player in the history of the school at the most important position. To get him to come back was a big win. I'll get a little bit on the rumors. I heard it from multiple sources that the reason he's not at a Florida, the reason he's not at an Auburn right now, I heard grades were a little bit of an issue. That's
no,
rumors.
I heard the same thing as you did, and I know people out there going, wait a second, he didn't have grades good enough despite those gaudy numbers to get into an SEC school. And it's not a dig at the SEC by any stretch, but I do begin to wonder how much time he's actually spent in class during his time in Coastal, but a different discussion for a different day, no doubt. Because much like you, I anticipated him going to a bigger program, trying to test his mettle and his stock to see if he could obviously get into the NFL in some capacity, knowing that arm strength was always going to hold him back a bit. But you talk about big-time numbers, I mean, a lot of reason to be excited, but he's not the only one returning on an offense that could be as explosive as what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to like about this offense. I'll say that right now, at least on paper, I think it's going to be the best offense in the Sun Belt. Top 2 rushers are back. The guy that I really liked was hurt most of last season, the Bennett kid. He's a very explosive athlete. Top 4 receivers return. I think maybe the best wide receiver in the Sun Belt, that Sam Pinckney kid, was a transfer last year. He's 6'4", had nearly 1,000 yards. He's back. They got enough experience on the offensive line, although they did lose their center to North Carolina. But again, how can you not like when you got McCall coming back? The best player in the Sun Belt the last 2-3 years on the offensive side of the ball, and pretty much everybody else is back. I mean, even if I'm not a huge Tim Beck fan, how can this offense not be productive?
I mean, we've watched enough NC State football over the last couple of years. That's the only reason that I think he could be the governor being put on the offense. We know he likes to use a short, controlled passing game, allow his playmakers to run after the catch, but it should be very interesting to see, what kind of step back, if at all, Coastal makes on the offensive side. But for all the optimism for this team's ability to move the football and put points up in bunches, Brad, defense was more or less optional for extended stretches last year when they ranked outside the top 100 nationally and ended up losing a ton after the season. 114th in passing success rate allowed, 127th in yards allowed per dropback, and 128th in first downs allowed per completion. Look, I watched Coastal the last couple games of the year. I ended up laying the number with JMU in that game late in the season, and I know all of us opposed them in their bowl game, and it was largely because this team just couldn't get stops under any circumstance.
No, I mean, they were bad. Pass defense, scoring defense, pretty much everything. And I know they were a little bit banged up, but it felt like, and they had an interim coach in the bowl game, but it looked like they waved the white flag the last 3 games of the season, especially on the defense side of the ball. Will they be better this year? I think a little bit, just because of the fact that, they, even though that they lost their best pass rushers, that Josiah Stewart kid's going to be a third down pass rush specialist in Michigan. He flashed a little bit in their spring game. That is a big loss for them, but a lot of their other key guys are back. So does it mean they make a monster leap up in when you're looking at the statistics? No, but I would have to think that they're a little bit better this year. I actually think they upgraded a defensive coordinator. So, yeah, they'll make a few more stops this year. Not saying much.
Like Payne used to say for a number of teams, just getting to average would be a monumental leap for some of the teams that we break down here. In Coastal's case, I'm not sure it's even getting close to average. It's just not being bargain basement on their stop unit. When we look at some of the other competition in the Sun Belt Eastern Division, Marshall comes to mind, and I did debate tweeting you the article that still is front and center on Marshall's football website about their upset win against Notre Dame, but don't like to throw salt in the wounds. Right out of the gates, Charles Huff enters his 3rd season there in Huntington. You're looking at a win total here, 7.5, shaded to the under. And last season, the Thundering Herd surged because they had a very aggressive defense. They ended up winning their last 5 games, weren't able to score in bunches, averaging a shade less than 24 points per game during that stretch, but held their opponents under 2 touchdowns. And I found this quote, something that you've highlighted in the past. When you're reading Athlon in the college football previews, you get quotes from some of the opposing coaches in the conference. And for Marshall, it was, "This is always the most athletic roster in the league. Huff is a really underrated motivator and evaluator and a rising star." when you look at Huff's pedigree, he's always been associated with elite rushing games and been around a boatload of game-changing backs, going all the way back to his time in Happy Valley when he worked with Saquon Barkley. Marshall, boom or bust as far as this season's outlook is concerned?
I would say a little bit in between. Don't have a lot of returning production back. Lost a lot of key guys on that really good defense. Lost their defensive coordinator, stud defensive coordinator, Lance Guidry, to Miami, Florida. That was a good hire for Cristobal, to say the least. And they were a legit defense. It wasn't just like, oh, they're good statistically because they're a group of 5. They were elite statistically. Number 4 in rush defense, number 6 scoring defense, number 7 total defense. And I'm here to tell you, personnel-wise, rewatching the Notre Dame game, when you got a couple of 6'2" cornerbacks, you got a couple of 300-pounders at defensive tackle, you got a good, solid scheme. I could see, looking back on it, why Notre Dame struggled in that game. You know me, I make 1,000+ bets a year. I would say top 5 worst bets of the season. I laid the points with Notre Dame in that game. Unbelievably terrible bet I made there. The question is how far this team can go. I think Todd resides on the offensive side of the ball. Fancher's back at quarterback. He was a little bit of a spark. He's not going to wow you with his arm or anything. He's a little bit mobile, but they won 6 of the 7 games that he was a starter last year. You're going to look, they lose Laybourne, the 5-star Florida State transfer that, was one of the more productive running backs in the country. I'm not that concerned because they get Ali back, who was one of the more productive running backs in the country 2 years ago, but missed most of last season. Most of the guys are back on the offensive line. I expect, like what you said, this will be a run-heavy offense, and that plays into Marshall's strengths, not only historically, but this season as far as personnel goes.
It's always interesting, too, when you look at some of these wrinkles that what these teams elect to deploy during their spring game, and Cam Fancher wasn't even out there taking reps. Huff and company decided that they would make him the offensive coordinator, claiming that they wanted him to develop a better understanding of calling plays, which I think is a fascinating way to look at how these guys go through their development and the kind of decision-making tree that they're able to better create on the field should communication break down or their ability to identify something that maybe some of the coaches aren't picking up. But there is no doubt, this is a Marshall team that was interesting to watch last year. You were able to cash a bevy of unders as the market didn't respond. And as far as Brad, you having the wrong side in that Notre Dame game, the great part about this business that we try and remind listeners about all the time, you can lose by 0.5 point, you can lose by 100. Last I checked, those bets count the exact same on the balance sheet.
Yeah, but when you're going out on, radio and podcast and giving out Notre Dame recommendations and they lose outright as a 3-touchdown favorite, it hurts a little bit more.
All right, I'll give you that much. We know losing in the public eye is a little bit tougher than losing on a spreadsheet where we watch the numbers go up and down over the course of a full college football season grind. So that is a very fair assessment, and I won't hold back there. Appalachian State, when we look at what Sean Clark has built in Boone, this was a program that took the college football world by storm during the month of September. The definition of highs and lows when you're talking about upsetting Texas A&M on the road, but losing to Old Dominion, having a chance to beat North Carolina in what amounted to one of the more exciting early season games in a 63-61 shootout. But things are going to look a little bit different in Boone. New coordinators, new quarterback, new tackles, and a lot of prominent roles to fill for a program who sees their win total suggesting that they're going to get bowl eligible, albeit by the slimmest of margins.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I did bet over 6.5. But again, I made over 100 season win total bets. Is it one of my favorites? No. I'm guessing it would rank in the bottom 20% as far as bets that I made. But you still got to play numbers, and it was at plus money. So the reason I'm a little concerned, you mentioned I'm anxious to see how the new coordinators work out, because I do think coaching was an issue last year. And there was 2 issues that I could point to. Coaching, when you're favored in 11 games and you only win 6, that's failing to meet expectations, in my opinion. Why did they fail to meet expectations? Well, when you're losing a bunch of close games, and that's been a little bit of an issue not only last year, but, in the entire Clark era, that's when I'm questioning, how you're handling the clock management and whatnot when App State traditionally, has more talent than their opposition in the Sun Belt. Where I think, maybe I can excuse some of the losses is, you mentioned it, Todd. They had as an emotional September, as anybody in the entire country. When you're talking about North Carolina to the very wire, one of the more exciting games, the A&M upset, the Hail Mary with College Game Day there, they're killing.
I had JMU on the money line in that particular spot too. Thought that ticket from an ATS standpoint was dead and buried, and then get ripped away from me at a nice double-digit price.
Troy?
Oh, Troy. Sorry, you're right. Troy.
And then JMU we gave that, we said, let's double down. Let's put our chips back in the very next week after App State wins on a Hail Mary. And they're killing JMU. And then my Twitter mentions are, blowing up because that was the best bet I gave on this podcast was JMU. And JMU rallies. And it looked like App State in that game ran out of gas. Yep. Not only that game, but the last 5 games of the season, they didn't cover any of them. So I can excuse it to some extent. But, man, I've mentioned this earlier. I'm not a big fan of offensive line coaches that become head coaches. I don't know what it is. I mentioned, I think, in the Memphis preview. It's just from a clock management, from an analytical aspect, I just don't see it with those guys that I do some of the other guys.
You know what's interesting, too, about App State this year? We talk about a lot of the turnover and the things they'll go through. They, of course, have a nice tune-up out of the gates with Gardner-Webb. But the non-conference schedule for me, Brad, it looks to be a little bit more difficult than it'll probably be given credit for. After Gardner-Webb, they go to North Carolina for a little bit of revenge scenario. But the Tar Heels are going to have their full attention and vice versa, given the way last game went. Then you have a game at home against an in-state program. I won't call it a rival. It's not like App State and ECU have a long history or tradition there. And then, just in case that wasn't bad enough, we're going to send you to altitude to play in Laramie against Wyoming for a non-conference game before you follow it up on the road at Louisiana Monroe. So I have a feeling with that schedule not looking to be overwhelming on paper, but just the variety of opponents and the ups and downs, we're going to get a pretty good indication of who App State is a program with the change at quarterback as well, pretty early on, maybe even before the calendar gets to October.
Yeah, we will. I'll say I expect them to go a little bit more run heavy. They really relied on Chase Bryce a little bit more than what some of the other quarterbacks in recent memory. He departs. They're not sure yet who's going to win the quarterback job between Aguilar and Berger, but I like Noah at running back. Top 3 receivers are back, so there are some experience around whoever that quarterback is. But yeah, again, when I made that bet, it wasn't great value. It's like I think they're 7-5. I don't think they're back to being the best team in this division or one of the very best in the conference. Slam dunk. It was just like I guess if they win another, a little bit better in one possession games, I could see 7-5. I'm not buying them completely here, and we'll know in September, like you mentioned.
Look, I mean, like you've told our listeners time and time again, when you're taking on this many win total positions, the bottom line is you grab the best of the number, going over 6.5 at plus money. Should you cool on Appalachian State closer to kickoff, you're going to have an opportunity to earn off of that particular ticket, knowing that you can go the very different direction now and be able to collect pennies on the dollar. So it's a different dynamic, and it's something that we always want to remind our listeners. Brad does this. He lives in the weeds when it comes to college football. So when he talks about win totals, it's all about number and price. Don't be chasing some of the bad numbers that are out there that Brad may have picked off in February and March that are going to put him in the 99% in rarefied air for guys that do this in this business. On to Georgia State. When we look at Sean Elliott, who will enter his 7th season, a lot of turnover from graduation and transfers. And when we looked at Georgia State last year, I mean, this is a team that when they were able to run the football, they could have a tremendous amount of success. When their ground game got bottled up, it was a little bit problematic. They do have a bevy of quarterback experience. When you look at Darren Granger and what he's meant to this program, a 6'4", 200-plus pound dual-threat quarterback that enters his 3rd season as the primary quarterback, has seen his passing totals climb each of the last few years. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's not meant as a knock on Granger. If they're going to ask him to win games with his arm, not exactly what the Panthers want to do on a week-in, week-out basis. When you look at Georgia State, Brad, their win total sits at 5.5, heavily shaded to the under at a prominent book. What do you see the season outlook appearing to be for this group in Atlanta?
5.5 is a fair number. That's about where I made it. I think they had success running the football last year, number 14 in the country in rush offense. And look, Granger is very capable he was the leading rusher last year. Marcus Carroll was one of their top 2 backs a year ago. He returns. They really love this KZ Adams kid who really flashed all spring long, highlighted by the spring game where he ran for 4 touchdowns and 150 plus yards. So I think they'll be able to run the football just as well as they did a year ago. They lose their top receiver. That Thrash kid to Louisville is going to be one of Louisville's best receivers, so that was a big loss. 4 of the top 5 are back there, so we'll see. But they really like this Merrimack FCS transfer, the Jakari Carter. More than one, articles I was reading about him that they like. So I wouldn't be a bit surprised that they're a little bit better offensively this year. If that's the case, then they could flirt with bowl eligibility because this is a team that did last year. What was the problem? And this is going to be a theme. 0-5 in one possession games. So when a lot of this talent level is pretty condensed and there's not much separating a lot of these teams in this conference, your ability to win close games is going to be the difference between 4-8 seasons and 7-5 seasons.
Hey, I mean, that's what you mentioned. I mean, razor-thin margins, especially in a league that isn't overly top-heavy, but also doesn't have some of the perennial doormats at the bottom that you can go out there and feast on. So if you're not buttoned up and have an ability to execute for a full 60 minutes, it's going to be a little bit problematic. When you look at Georgia State on the defensive side of the ball, I mean, this was a real problem. In their losses, Georgia State allowed 37 points per game. Is there reason to be optimistic that the stop unit can at least be a little better than what we saw the majority of 2022?
I'm not sure. There's just many question marks as answers right now. I mean, the biggest concern is going to be their secondary. They lost one of their best pass rushers to Louisville. Louisville did well. We'll talk about that next week. Louisville did really well in the transfer portal. The kid that they really liked is a Clemson transfer, Kevin Swint. He was their best defender in the spring, so that kind of offsets at the same position that Jeffrey Clark was playing. So that offsets a little bit. But again, if I'm stack ranking defenses in the Sun Belt, this would be a below-average defense. That's
a fair assessment, and we'll get a pretty good indication of exactly what Georgia State is on the defensive side of the ball with 2 non-conference games against somewhat manageable opponents, taking on UConn and Charlotte in back-to-back weeks after their season opener against Rhode Island. Brett, it's not often that people leave Los Angeles and find a home in Statesboro, Georgia, but that's exactly what we have for Clay Helton, who will enter his second season at the helm, completely transform the program from an option attack to a pass-happy approach with Kyle Van Treese and Jeremy Singleton. Van Treese threw for more than 4,200 yards and 27 touchdowns, including the game that you mentioned at the top when he went out there and went for 400-plus and 45 points against Nebraska. He's gone, but in steps Davis Brin from Tulsa to fill the role. There are also some other interesting quarterback prospects as well on the roster. Were you surprised with the progress that Clay Helton was able to make in his first season down there, completely revamping this team's offensive philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, I've watched the spring game the last 2 years, so I wasn't totally surprised because I watched last year's spring game. I'm like, wow, they look pretty competent throwing the football for going from the option to this. So I wasn't surprised early. And where did I bet it? I bet some overs early, but man, the market caught up quick to them very quickly. As far as that value got dried up in like 2 weeks. Easy winners the first couple weeks, and then good night. But yeah, I wasn't as surprised as other people were. But historically, usually when you're talking, it's, the Georgia Tech struggles moving away from the option, still ongoing from Paul Johnson and some of the other schools transition when it usually takes several years to do it overnight, go from run heavy to pass heavy and have success doing it. Kudos to Clay Helton. Obviously not a lot of people's favorite coach while he's at SC, but he's got a clue. And I'll be honest with you, typically you would think, oh, man, they lose a 4,000-yard-plus passer. I mean, the drop-off? No, Davis Brin will be fine watching the spring game. I mean, they were just as good as what they were a year ago. I mean, running fast tempo, throwing the ball down the field vertically, watching the spring. They'll be just fine. They got a lot of playmakers offensively. This will be one of the best offenses in the Sun Belt.
Interesting story on the defensive side. Brandon Bailey returns home and said it was pretty emotional for him to have the opportunity to take over as defensive coordinator for Georgia Southern. This was a guy who finished out last year as the defensive coordinator in Buffalo. Ironically enough, those are the two programs that played one another in their bowl game. He talked about how quickly it ended up happening, and what I found fascinating is some of his quotes indicated that his goal was to install as much of his defense as he could entering the spring, which tells me there are inevitably going to be growing pains for a stop unit that didn't provide much resistance last year, especially knowing that there's significant roster turnover with the difference makers that they relied on a season ago.
So I would typically be really concerned because I had a really bad defense a year ago, bottom 5 in the country in total defense. I only got 3 starters back. I got a new system. I got a lot of new guys coming in. But again, I love that they posted the spring game. I thought the defense beat the offense in the spring game. And particularly, he did exactly what he did to Georgia Southern's offense in the bowl game. They gave up yardage, but when it came down to the red zone, they prevented Georgia Southern's offense, and I'm talking the defense here, prevented the offense from getting in the end zone, settling for field goals. So I'll tell you what, that they did a really good job of scouting the transfer portal because they got 5-6 transfers coming in, and all of them I think are going to start, and all of them I think are going to be upgrades for Georgia Southern. So this could be an underrated defensive unit heading into the season.
Underrated maybe there. I'm not sure what to make of this particular program in Old Dominion, who is in fertile recruiting grounds. A lot of reason to be optimistic when they made the coaching hire they did. Ricky Rain enters his 3rd season, finished last year, though, with a 6-game losing streak after a decent start to the campaign. A lot of optimism about the coaching staff and the capabilities. Obviously, you have to upgrade the roster and make sure that you have some difference makers there. We talked a little bit about losing Hayden Wolf in the transfer portal on the offensive side. Speculation there that he may not have won the job anyway, so that was part of what could have contributed to him going to the Mid-American Conference. Defensively, look, it's always difficult to replace a disruptive defensive tackle in the form of Alonzo Ford, who was a late transfer to Penn State after the spring window. Don't have to spend a ton of time on ODU when you look at their win total, 4.5, heavy shaded to the under. What do you make of the Monarchs this season and the way the market has kind of graded them out, at least initially?
Yeah, I'm not buying it. So I've taken a couple positions. Under 4.5, wasn't afraid to lay significant juice on that. Bet also under 4 wins, so I really liked it. I mean, I got them more than a field goal underdog in 11 of their 12 games. Does that mean they're going to go 1-11? No, but I just, for them, they're going to have to pull 3 outright upsets just to get the 4 wins. I don't see it. I'll say one thing, a couple things positive. I do like their new coordinator. It comes from Fordham. I just think, does he have the players to be successful right out of the gates? If you weren't following Fordham, very high tempo, very successful offense at the FCS level the last 3 years. But, I mean, losing your quarterback, whether he won the job or not, more importantly, Blake Watson was a really good running back the last 2 years for them. He's gone. Allie Jennings is a really good wide receiver. He's off to Virginia Tech. He's gone. Defensively, they bring their star back in Jason Henderson. FBS high, 186 tackles. 186 tackles, not 3 years, 1 year. He's back, but pretty much everybody else is gone. So, I mean, schedule-wise, returning production, I don't see it, so I'm not buying ODU.
I mean, look, Brad, I'm all about scheme and cleaning things up for your linebackers, but when they have to make 186 tackles, it tells me that your defensive line ain't doing a damn thing to try and slow down players from getting to the second level. You mentioned the offensive coordinator they bring over. You know, at least from a continuity standpoint, if Grant Wilson does win the job, that's the same quarterback that he worked with at Fordham. So very interesting to see how those guys.
Wasn't the starter, though. I looked into that.
He was
like,
the backup
is this the
there,
kid
right?
that was putting up? Yeah, I was thinking, is this the kid that was, part of putting up, 50 against Ohio? No, wasn't a starter. Barely any attempts the last 2 years. So that kind of, negated that a little bit.
Yeah, it should temper the enthusiasm, and you wonder why that wasn't the case. You figure familiarity goes a long way, but will the talent be there to try and match? Before we go east to west, I want to remind all of you, our loyal listeners, to follow Brad on Twitter, at BradPower7. Brad does an outstanding job, not only with us here at Bet the Board, but across a variety of platforms. If you feel we haven't dived deep enough on some of these conference previews, Brad will provide analysis in a few other unique spots as well. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me on social media. You can follow the third member of our Holy Trinity who has decided not to grace us with his presence through the Group of 5 portion of breakdowns. That, of course, would be Payne Insider. And most importantly, as always, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. If you haven't already done so, subscribe to the Bet the Board newsletter. Great information, articles, and reminders about all the things to try and put your money in a great place with the upcoming football season. The first edition of that newsletter in 2023, for this season at least, should go live as soon as this Friday. All right, Brad, we covered the East in tremendous detail. It's time to look at the West and start with a program that burst onto the scene last year in the Troy Trojans under first-year head coach John Summerall. Finished last year with a win streak second only to the Georgia Bulldogs, albeit their bowl win. I'm still trying to figure out how UTSA didn't run away and hide, but that's a different story for a different day. Offense was a placeholder, arguably, for a defense that could operate and execute at an incredibly high level. And when you watch that group week in, week out, I'd put them in that middle of the pack if they were an ACC program defensively. As a result, for all of his hard work, Summerall received a contract extension in the spring, which will keep him in Troy, or at least make his buyout a little bit more untenable through the 2026 season. So we can start with an area that was a weakness for the Trojans last year. When you look at their win total at 8.5 now, do we think that Troy can take the next step offensively? Because you have to imagine that there will be at least a minor defensive regression, knowing that they lost some difference makers there.
Yeah, I don't know. I would think that, looking at the personnel, what they got coming back, I would expect them to be about as, average as what they were a year ago, I think, and that's being nice probably. Watson's back at quarterback. He needs to cut down on turnovers. Vidal is back at running back, so that's good. I worry they lose two of their key guys. They lose their center, who got taken in the 4th round. So that's saying a lot there, what they thought about their leader up front on the offensive line. This Tez Johnson kid is going to be a star at Oregon this year. He was their top, wide receiver, one of their top wide receivers for Troy a year ago. He transfers to the Ducks, and again, he's going to be probably maybe even an all Pac-12 caliber player. So that worries me, but when you got the quarterback back, the running back, and you weren't that good to begin with a year ago, I think they'll continue to be average.
You mentioned Tez Johnson, and what's interesting for anybody who's read some of the reports coming out of Eugene, I mean, they think this kid is going to be the real deal there, and Oregon had talked at great lengths about him being a difference maker on a variety of fronts. So we'll see if some of the other players in that receiving group can ultimately step up. Defensively, look, this was a Troy team led by Carlton Marshall that went out there and wreaked havoc on a week-in, week-out basis. Yeah. But you do lose your defensive coordinator in Sheil Wood to Tulane. Why is it interesting? Well, Wood's going to match up with his former employer week 1 right out of the gates. So it's storyline to keep tabs on for those folks that are handicapping that contest. But there is still reason to be optimistic about a lot of returning production. TJ Jackson, Richard Jabuner, Reddy Stewart, and a couple of other players up front that are going to command headlines. Impossible, though, at least for me, Brad, and tell me otherwise if you think that Troy can actually improve on the gaudy numbers they put forth last year.
No, they're going to take a step back. And look, when we're talking group of 5 defenses, I mean, obviously they're at the very top last year. But I would say when you looked at their personnel and scheme a year ago, I would say that was one of the better group of 5 defenses I've seen in the last 5-6 years in college football. That's how dominant they were. I mean, losing your defensive coordinator is going to hurt to begin with. And then, I mean, Carlton Marshall, if you're not familiar, you should be. I mean, the all-time leader in the history of the NCAA in tackles, 526, is gone. He finally, exhausted his eligibility. So that's a loss. But you mentioned it, though. I mean, I still think that they're going to get after the quarterbacks. I love their 2 ends. Jibinor and Jackson, 15.5 sacks are back. Solomon and Brown are really good on the defensive line. I still think it's the best defensive line by far in the Sun Belt. So when it starts up front, I think they'll be pretty capable there. They're just not going to be I almost want to use the word elite, at least from the group of 5 level. That was an elite defense last year. They might not be there this year, but they're still going to be damn good.
What do you make of Troy's schedule on the whole? I mean, they'll start with Stephen F. Austin. That should be a win. They'll go to Kansas State. We can assume that's going to be a loss, barring some unforeseen circumstances. But you look at the conference portion of things, and the most difficult opponents they'll play all come into Troy that they'll get in their own building. I mean, road games at Georgia State, at Army, obviously not conference game, a non-conference game, at Texas State, at ULM, and maybe a trickier game, a team that we'll get to in a minute, when they go to Hattiesburg to close things out. But at least on the surface for me, schedule looks to be relatively favorable, even if we have questions about the offense and the defense living up to the preseason standard.
Yeah, it's the most important factor in breaking down this team, because I was expecting regression. 6-1 in one-possession games last year. That can't be the same again this year. A team that had one of the very best ATS records in the country, that should make them overvalued. And then we already talked about the personnel losses, specifically on defense. So I was thinking, I'm not going to be as high on Troy. Well, going to be going under their win total. Nope, wrong. I mean, it couldn't be any more favorable as far as the schedule. All them toss-up games are all at home. James Madison, Western Kentucky, South Alabama, Louisiana, Lafayette, all of them at home. I mean, right now, with my current power ratings, I got them favored in every game, but the road trip to Kansas State. So big reason why I bet over 8 wins, and would still lean over 8.5.
A team, Brad, that was a thorn in their side in the Sun Belt West last year, a game that they slipped by, was South Alabama to the score of 10-6, which got them to the conference championship. And when we look at the Jaguars and what's expected of them throughout the market, their win total 7.5 shaded to the over, a non-conference schedule that doesn't provide a whole lot in the way of soft landing spots. But Kane Womack deserves a ton of credit, and he'll enter his third season at the charge for South Alabama, completed the best season as an FBS program. Obviously trying to do everything he can to tap into an underrated and fertile recruiting ground in the Gulf Coast area. A lot of ties between Mississippi State and South Alabama, with a number of players moving from the SEC to the potentially rising Sun Belt power. If you believe some of the Athlon preseason rankings, 18 players in some capacity made a first through fourth team as far as all Sun Belt honors. Wow. And one of the reasons that there's a high level of optimism down there in Mobile is because of their starting quarterback in Carter Bradley, who returns after throwing for 3,300 yards and 28 touchdowns, a Toledo transfer last year that gave them stability there. But the nice part for the Jags is there are actually backups on this roster at quarterback that are reason to provide some level of optimism as well. When you look at South Alabama, flash in the pan or real staying power here as the team to beat in the West?
No, absolute staying power here. Not anything fluky, even though, again, they had a good record in one-possession games. Best season in school history a year ago. This would be a team, if they hosted Troy, I'd be pounding on the table. This is your Sun Belt champion for this year. I just worry that they got to go to Troy this year. But when you look at what they got coming back, you mentioned it. 18 returning starters. Forget the Sun Belt. That's one of the most experienced teams in the country. Signed their best recruiting class in 7 years. Kane Womack's back. This is a guy that former DC at Indiana. He leaves. Indiana really drops off the face of the earth, and you've seen the good job that he's done here. Carter Bradley's back. Decent quarterback. Had a solid ratio. You'd like to see him cut down on the interception a little bit. LaDamian Webb's a really good running back. Top 2 receivers are back. Defensively, we'll get into it if you want to, but top 6 tacklers are back for them. A lot to like about this team. So they are right there neck and neck with Troy in the West. And Troy, and comparing it to the East, Troy and South Alabama are 2 teams that are better than any teams in the East, in my opinion.
Well, you mentioned that defense, and it's not like it requires a massive deep dive by any stretch of the imagination. You talked about the returning level of experience and starters overall. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure, okay, if they have 18 returning starters, a lot of those guys have to be on the defensive side as well. And there are some real difference makers at all 3 levels as far as what this defense is going to look like in the 2023 season.
Yeah, certainly. So they were really good against the run last year, number 3 in the country, in fact. Top 6 tacklers are back. But one thing that caught my eye, though, I like their secondary. Their 2 safeties are really good. Yam Banks, 6 interceptions. That Voisin kid was their leading tackler. So not a lot of weakness. I know it wasn't as good as, obviously, as Troy's defense was a year ago, but I would not be a bit surprised. This could be, one of, if not the top defense in the Sun Belt this year. If that's the case, with what they have coming back on offense, really tough team here.
This is a program that I'm real curious to get your take on. Not like I'm always curious to get your take on some of the other teams, but in terms of trying to figure them out, because I was a big fan of the head coach that they had who left for Florida, and that, of course, would be the Louisiana Ragin' Cajuns, who saw their record plummet from 13-1 after Billy Napier took off to 6-7 under their first-year head coach, Michael DeSormo. Obviously, there's reason for optimism, is that a lot of projected starters have now been in the system for 3+ years down there in Lafayette, Louisiana. But they have to go about developing an offensive identity. In my opinion, you look at the quarterback tandem, Ben Woolridge, Chandler Fields, neither one of them asserted himself as a true number 1 quarterback a season ago. And for me, Brad, I feel sometimes these group of 5 programs, you can upgrade and immediately take that next step. But for Louisiana, there was people that thought, hey, look, this program isn't going to miss a beat once they lose Billy Napier. I was of a different mindset. I don't want to be too knee-jerk, however, based on just one season. I'm kind of curious to get your take on what you see Lafayette's identity for this season, and if there is reason to be concerned about the trajectory and the staying power of this team amongst the Sun Belt Western Conference elite.
I am a little bit concerned. I thought they were, though, a little bit better than the record a year ago, 0-4 in one-possession games. But, that's your only sample size, your only data points for a young head coach. You got to question bad coaching, not managing the game like you should. This year, lightly. I mean, we just talked about how experienced South Alabama was. Opposite for this Louisiana team, not much experience. Wooldridge and Fields are back at quarterback, although they didn't participate in the spring. Everything I read said they should be good to go fall camp. There's a lot of question marks, especially on defense, especially when you lose your two very best guys in the secondary post-spring to the portal, and one of them went to Alabama. So that would be extremely concerning for me. But there is a saving grace. And the saving grace is we're talking about teams playing difficult schedules in this league and whatnot. Louisiana, by far, plays the easiest schedule of anybody in this conference this year. You talk about avoiding teams out of the East. No App State, no Coastal Carolina, no JMU. And a lot of their winnable games are at home. I mean, Texas State, Georgia State, UL Monroe, some of the bottom teams, all at home for them. You look at non-conference, UAB's down. I mean, I think that game could be winnable. Buffalo's at home, very winnable. I mean, the only Power 5 team they play is Minnesota. So a very advantageous schedule, I think, is going to be the saving grace, and why this team, I think, actually improves their record a year ago, even with a lightly returning production.
Hey, look, I mean, schedules are the great equalizer in college football. You can return absolutely nothing, but if you're playing nothing but a bunch of soup cans on a week-in, week-out basis, it's going to help. You look at Louisiana, and you mentioned how favorable the schedule is. The only wrench being thrown into that mix, they'll play the two toughest teams in their half of the draw on the road, but other than that, should definitely be able to navigate through some of those uncharted waters, minus the trip to the Twin Cities to take on the Minnesota Golden Gophers. What's interesting about this next program, Brad, in Southern Miss, is that this was a group last year that showed well for stretches, but they were mired, in my opinion, in inconsistency more often than not. And when you look at the Southern Miss team right now, their win total is 5.5, shaded to the under at some spots. I've seen some books shaded over. I know this is up a touch from where it opened. And what I found interesting about some of Will Hall's comments coming out of the spring is they said, we hit a lot and tackled all the amount of times that we could tackle, and we were very physical. I was just pleased with the overall approach, and we are in a lot better spot ending spring than at any other point than we should be. This is year 3. They are able to get their first bowl win in 2016. Doesn't matter that it came against Rice that only qualified because of APR at a 5-7 record. It's an offense that was oftentimes a work in progress, but reason to believe that this group could be better, albeit not exactly 5-star blue chip prospects under center, but defensively, some reason for excitement as well. When you look at Will Hall's roster that he has to deal with this year in Hattiesburg, where do you begin to look at as positions of strength and positions of weakness for the Southern Miss Golden Eagles?
Well, it's better than what he's had, specifically better than what he had 2 years ago when they were down to 62 scholarship players, and they remarkably saw 10 different players take a snap under center, and their most effective guy was from under center was probably Frank Gore, the outstanding running back who is back yet again. So, I like, even though there's still some uncertainty at quarterback, I think, they've said this. It's the deepest, healthiest, and most experienced quarterback room that they've had. They'll probably rely on one of the two transfers from Houston or Clemson will be their starting quarterback. So whoever it is should be more consistent. You mentioned the inconsistency last year. I think it mainly had to do with the quarterback play. Why they were inconsistent, why they could beat a Tulane and then turn right around and get upset the very next week. It was just inconsistencies at that position. No matter who the quarterback is, though, it's nice when you can turn right around and hand it off to Frank Gore. You mentioned the bowl game. He only ran for a bowl record, not that bowl record, the Lending Tree Bowl record. Any bowl record, 329 yards a year ago. He's back. I really like what they have up front. A lot of size on offensive line. 325 pounds is the average starting weight for them. They do lose their defensive coordinator for Florida, and I think that kid's a future superstar. His name's Austin Armstrong. So that'll be a question mark on defense, but up front, as good as anybody in the conference with all 4 starters back on the defensive line. Keep in mind they're top 5 in the country nationally in sacks and TFLs. They'll be very disruptive. Win total. I did take an over position, laid some juice early. Right now, I would still, if you can find a 5, I would still lean over there. But nothing, I don't think that's, let's run and race to the window and hold up our money for 6 months.
Southern Miss is interesting, too, because they kick off their schedule with Alcorn State. They'll travel to Tallahassee to take on Florida State, a revenge game, but in their own building against Tulane. You wonder how the market could potentially overreact if they were to struggle against the likes of the Seminoles and the Green Wave there, and see if there's a gross miscalculation in terms of what this team is capable of accomplishing. The quarterback position, no doubt, going to be fascinating to see who they lean on and if they're able to get a little bit more stability there. But from a defensive standpoint, you highlighted the same things that stuck out to me. Should be a lot of continuity up front. And against teams in their own weight class, they should be able to at least hold their own from a defensive side in terms of trying to stop the run. What I think is interesting about this team is when they were able to stop the run, they had success. When they couldn't, that's obviously where problems started to ensue. From Will Hall in Hattiesburg and the reclamation project there to a coach who may be on a very short leash, and it's a familiar name for college football fans all over, that, of course, being Butch Jones and what he's trying to do in Jonesboro, Arkansas. 5-19, Brad, ain't going to get it done through the first two seasons there. Their win total sits at 4.5. And when you look at the overall recruiting profile for Arkansas State, there's reason to be optimistic that things are there. Jones on his spring game, I'm appreciative to our players. I think they've maintained a great attitude through the course of spring, but we have to have the best summer we've ever had. We have to continue to learn. A lot of these individuals are getting a lot of repetitions and large volume of plays for the first time. Today was another learning opportunity, but also a great evaluation tool. We'll have yada, 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 weight rooms, academics, and all of that. When we look at
champions of life.
Exactly. When we look at Arkansas State, are you drinking the Kool-Aid that Butch is trying to pour for us that this team can flirt with bowl eligibility in 2023?
I'm not, and this is one, though, that there is some resistance on the market on this one, so it'll be interesting to see if old Brad Powers can get one over everybody else out there.
You're going to take a bet? I mean, wait a second. Are you admitting that there is at least a 1% chance that of all these win totals, you may end up with a number going the opposite direction here, Brad?
I could have gotten a better number, I'll put it that way. I bet under 4.5 plus money, and a sharper book yesterday opened 5 in Circa, so that's... When I don't get the very best of the number, I worry a little bit. I mean, I see look, if you told me he's going to for sure get to next season, I can see it because they have signed the best class, the recruiting class in the Sun Belt each of the last 2 years. Problem is, these kids are still freshmen and sophomores. And again, we've already outlined some teams. I mean, one we just talked about, Southern Miss, grown men at the line of scrimmage. That's not going to be a good recipe for Arkansas State. A lot of transfers. I don't know how they're all if they're going to work out or not. JT Shroud at quarterback, we'll see. He's talented. Rucker's back from South Carolina after he was here a couple years ago. Courtney Jackson from Syracuse at wide receiver, I think, is a good, solid guy. Offensive line could start as many as 4 transfers. There's just a lot of disruption on offense. Defense brings back a ton of experience. The problem is they have stunk the last 2 years, especially 2 years ago. So I don't know. I mean, who cares if they're back? These players have stunk. Kid to look out for is his Kansas transfer, Gavin Potter. What I'm getting at is, I've already said it, I'm not buying it. I'm not buying Butch Jones. And when the rest of the league, there's no easy layups in this conference, I don't know if he's got the coaching acumen to overcome some of these personnel losses and to overcome and beat the Troys, South Alabamas, the Southern Misses of the world in that division. So, yeah, I think it's 4-8, and if that's the case, he's gone. Pack his bags.
Yeah, and Arkansas State doesn't exactly have a soft landing spot. They'll go to Norman for their season opener to take on the Oklahoma Sooners. They'll get a home date against a revamped and what should be improved edition of the Memphis Tigers, a little bit of a layup against Stony Brook, and that's where things start to get interesting with a trio of games, 2 within the division. Southern Miss at home at Troy with a trip to Amherst, Massachusetts, sandwiched in between. Brad, I had a weird fixation, call it what you will, when I broke down this particular team, and that, of course, is the Texas State Bobcats in San Marcos, Texas. They make a change at the helm, bringing in G.J. Kinney to take things over, and I tweeted about it. You accurately caught on to my messaging there. It makes me feel extremely old because I remember when Kinney was under center at Tulsa betting on or against him. It's a program that hasn't had a winning campaign since 2014, and Jake Spavital wasn't able to get the program where it needed to be on either side of the ball. So what do we have here? It becomes an incarnate word takeover. So Kinney brings both coordinators, a number of other assistants, at least 7 incarnate word players, including a boatload of all-conference offensive linemen and all-conference defensive backs, to a new landing spot. But it was a complete roster turnover, albeit one from a head coach that led one of the more remarkable offensive turnarounds in all of the FCS, an incarnate word. Group that averaged over 50 points per game, and for anybody that watched the FCS playoffs, gave North Dakota State at least a little bit of a scare, given some of the high-powered potential and capabilities they had. But I'm always curious how these things adapt, how they adjust, and if it's as simple as flipping a switch to get this offense humming in Bobcat country.
So obviously, I mean, Colorado's gotten the headlines for what they've done with the roster and the overhaul, almost a completely different roster. If there was one roster at the G5 level that's completely overhauled, it's this Texas State team. I mean, he's bringing in 51 new players, including 37 transfers. A lot of kids from Incarnate Ward. We'll see if there'll be familiarity with the system, but the talent level, obviously, we've talked about it all podcast long, much better in the Sun Belt than what it would be in a relatively mediocre conference at Southland. That they're coming from. So I got some question marks there. On the positive side, I mean, they're going to have an athlete at quarterback, whether it's Malik Hornsby, big get from Arkansas, dynamic athlete, and they just added TJ Finley from Auburn, big kid. Looks like Cam Newton, doesn't play like Cam Newton, but still, I mean, at this level, it could be a factor. I just think, man, with 0 returning starters on the offensive line, with so much roster turnover, and we're talking about a program that has not done very well here, at least in the last almost decade, I'm more on the negative side. And then you look at the schedule, and I'm just not seeing it for them, which leads me to, we'll talk about it in 5 minutes. We'll say.
Look, I mean, if you're running a program at Texas State, somewhere along the way, you may have to go to a Paul Blake. You bring in Coach Ed Gennaro. You get Kathy Ireland as your kicker, and you're able to turn things around. But maybe it's as simple and straightforward as changing your nickname from the Bobcats to the Armadillos.
They're going to beat the number 1 ranked Texas Colts.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes, Brad, that's what has to
Jason
happen.
Bateman.
I just feel like it was completely miscast in terms of the jerseys and everything they wore. They looked a lot more like the North Texas Mean Green than they did Texas State back in the day. But we are definitely dating ourselves now, a movie that came out, I think, when I was 9 years old back in 1991. For those folks that may be younger listeners, encourage you to check out Unnecessary Roughness.
Good movie.
You can see what old school AstroTurf looked like, where that movie was shot, and how dangerous that was to ripping up players' knees and legs compared to the modern iteration of field turf, to say the least. But this will be a team that it'll be a monumental success or a colossal failure, to your point, as we watch and try and figure out if GJ Kinney can get them turned around completely. Before we get to the final team in the Sun Belt, Brad, I do have to mention that you have to be careful when you talk about this head coach. He comes from a Florida State legacy, so Payne's feelings could get hurt if you want to throw Terry Bowden under the bus, who will enter his 3rd season in Monroe. Another complete roster overhaul taking place for the UL Monroe Warhawks this season after last year. Nearly half the group turned over. The Warhawks have finished above 500 just once since returning to FBS in 1994, and honestly, that number blew me away. I knew Monroe hadn't exactly been the gold standard by any stretch of the imagination. I didn't realize it had been that bleak down there. Starting quarterback Chandler Rogers, who we talked about in our American Athletic preview, transfers to North Texas, so we'll see a change under center there. There are a couple of proven commodities and reason to be excited about what they have on the offensive side, but from a defensive standpoint, they allowed nearly 35 points per game last year. They were last in the FBS in takeaways at 8. The Warhawks, when they allowed less than 5.7 yards per play, they ended up going 4-1 in those games. The problem, Brad, is more often than not, the defense resembled a sieve than a steel curtain. When you look at Louisiana Monroe for Terry Bowden at the helm, what do we think is realistic for them, knowing their win total 3.5 with heavy, heavy juice going under the total?
Yeah, not buying it. While I can see some excitement on who we just mentioned, Texas State and GJ Kinney, I don't want to, again, hurt the feelings of Payne, but I I think it's a coach over the hill. He's done actually a good job getting them to 4 wins the last couple of years. They've exceeded expectations when you look at an outright upset over their arch rival Louisiana a year ago. I'm just not seeing it this year from a personnel aspect. I mean, their best players are gone. I mean, that Cutler kid, left tackle, one of their best players, gone to Ohio State, transferred. I mean, I watched one of their games. I literally highlighted one player on the offense or defense combined. It was one of their defensive linemen, the Ledette kid. He's gone, transferred to Texas Tech, so I wasn't the only one that was impressed with that kid. I don't see it from a skill position aspect. Don't see it at the line of scrimmage. Just don't see it, period. And, my power rankings don't see it either. 11 underdog roll in 11 of their 12 games. Most of them significant underdog rolls. So this is one where I bet under 3.5. And again, even at the current juice, would not be afraid to go ahead and make that bet.
mean, I can only say so many negative things about Monroe, knowing that we backed them as a best bet on this very program back on October 8th against Coastal Carolina, a game that honestly, for those folks that watch, looked like it was shot on a handy cam, and I got nauseous watching the third and fourth quarter there on one of the ESPN Plus streams. But the links that we'll go to watch some of those programs that are there. The one question I have for you on Monroe, and not to put you on the spot if you don't have this in front of you, so I apologize in advance. When you look at Monroe and you look at their season outlook, to put in perspective, we talked about the top of the Sun Belt and some of the expectations there. Where does Monroe rank at the bottom as far as overall profiles for Group of 5 programs?
Yeah, it's bottom half dozen teams in the country. Obviously, still Massachusetts and some of the other ones are still worse than them, but got them ranked 127th overall right now.
All right, so with quick math there, 133 teams in the FBS, not exactly a great spot to be in if you're a Monroe Warhawks fan, hoping for bowl eligibility for the first time in a long time. You can
hoping. Yeah, I got to hope that even though it's been 30 years after that movie, that Kathy Ireland would still, I could go on I wouldn't even call it a date. I just, be happy to see what she looks like.
I got a feeling she probably hasn't lost a step. I'm not going to lie. If she looks anything like teenage heartthrob Tiffany Amber Thiessen after her prominent role in Saved by the Bell, I mean, some of those celebrities in Hollywood, whether it's making deals with the devil or anything else, they look a hell of a lot better with their pursuits and professional occupations than guys like the three of us do when we sit behind computers all day and watch the hours and sand tick through the hourglass, trying to find angles worth exploiting in the college football market. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPowers7. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Follow Payne as well at Payne Insider. And again, most importantly, follow at Bet the Board Pod. Subscribe to the Bet the Board newsletter and make sure that you're on the lookout for fresh episodes of Cardboard Chat covering the trading card and memorabilia space. And of course, stay green as we try and help you build those bankrolls during NASCAR season in anticipation of football that's right around the corner. One final order of business, though, Brad, that we have to transact on this fine program before we officially close the book on the Group of 5 podcast series, and that would be identifying a little bit of a wagering opportunity amongst numbers that are currently and or widely available in terms of win totals or conference futures.
Yeah, we're going to go Texas State under 4.5 wins. The 4.5 number is available at several books, DraftKings, FanDuel, BetOnline. Best price, again, like some of these other episodes, we're going to have to lay a little bit of juice here. Minus 145 at William Hill Caesar. So under 4.5 wins for Texas State. Look, I am buying it long-term, just not buying it short-term. Just way too much of a roster overhaul here for a program that hasn't topped 4 wins in the last 8 years. And I just don't see it this year, especially when almost everybody in this conference, you just don't have any layups in this conference. So going to go under here, and I'll say this. Even though I could see and picture Malik Hornsby having some success at quarterback, or if it's TJ Finley, just cannot see them getting to 5 wins. So we're going to go under here, and hopefully we can cash that ticket.
Program that obviously can buy stock in at the bottom, but we know year zero for new head coach going through complete roster overhaul can inevitably endure some growing pains, to say the least.
Quick, one thing I want to mention, this is a little bit behind the weeds, pull behind the curtain, but I like when sharper books agree with me, and just yesterday, Circa opened their win total, Texas State, at 3.5. So that led me to believe I think we're on the right side here.
All right, we'll take advantage. As always, shop around for the best of the number there. There's no reason in this racket to take a bad price. Like we tell people all the time, with no particular books in mind, the best thing and the easiest way to improve that ROI for football season, both during the regular season and the off season. Take your bankroll, whatever it may be, spread it around to a few different outlets. We're not telling you to have 15 or 20 for those folks new to the space, but if you have one book, make it 2. If you have 2 books, make it 4, and just do everything you can to put your money into a good spot to maximize some of your earning potential as football season is right around the corner. All right, my friend, Group of 5 previews officially in the tank, and looks like we've cleared up about half the field. We'll transition next week to some of the Power 5 leagues. We'll welcome Payne back into the fold. But, Brad, we're going to have to make him prove his mettle here. It's not like he's going to come in and try and, take over the show. He's not going to be the featured bell cow back where we run 50 plays on offense and he carries the rock 41 times. So we'll have to make sure that his preseason conditioning is up to snuff, since you and I are already hitting our stride and in midseason form at this juncture.
Yeah, I don't care who you are. If you're a 5-star recruit, that we don't guarantee starting positions. We'll give you opportunities, and he'll have an opportunity to prove his mettle. But again, he doesn't start off in the pole position.
I like it. I mean, this is, we can promise you a starting position. Coming into fall camp, at the bottom line is you have to work for it. If you've been doing the work as far as the speed and conditioning, and you've been doing your part at the training table, you'll get your reps there. And Payne, I know you're out there listening to Brad and I, so take that to heart and make sure you get some of those extra reps in over the next week. But Brad, it's been fun, man. Had a great time deep diving a lot of these smaller schools. I know the feedback from our listeners has been outstanding. Since the amount of information that you're able to uncover through your power ratings that you do all by hand in terms of starters, depth, identifying the transfer portal that a lot of the publications don't cover, go a long way in terms of getting our listeners in the right mindset when they're trying to figure out some of these smaller programs.
Thoroughly enjoyed it. First time I've ever deep dived this early on smaller conferences, and couldn't enjoyed it more. But I will say this. I'm ready to talk some bigger schools, especially schools that, I watch their spring game and can have, it's a little bit easier. I don't have to be going down a rabbit hole to find information.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is, where my job as a point guard gets easier. I can run the half-court offense. I throw the ball at the rim and hope that you and Payne take home the alley-oops to be able to make things work. But if you're looking for more of Brad, like we said, we encourage you to go back and listen to all of our Group of 5 previews. You can find those on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Rate, review, subscribe to the Bet the Board podcast. 5-star ratings go a long, long way, and we appreciate all of the feedback that you guys offer up both in the comment section and, of course, the interactions on social media. However, most importantly, if we leave you with one thing as far as the Sun Belt is concerned, with the Texas State Armadillos win total ticket in hand, we hope they go under the total, and hopefully we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.